Hey guys, so today I want to give you an overview of Pigments, this new synth by Arturia, which they call their polychrome wavetable or polychrome digital synthesizer, I believe. Which certainly seems to be true if we look at it. It has a lot of colors, it's called Pigments, so I won't have an argument there. What I want to do in this video is I want to give you an overview of the different functions, the different things that it can do. I'm going to point out some of the more advanced features, and while we're doing that we're going to try to come up with a cool sound as well, so that we get a little bit of everything. Before that, I just want to very quickly share my own thoughts. I've been playing around with this for 3 or 4 days now, and I really liked it actually. To me, it seemed like a great combination in between digital and analog processing, which is what Arturia is known for, of course. And it has a very sort of modern, sleek interface, but it's very easy to use, even though it looks a little bit different than some of the stuff we're used to. But the main powerful thing, I think, is that it has 2 different engine types. So right now we're seeing the Wavetable type. It also has an analog type, which looks like this, and we can actually switch between those. So that makes it, for me, a great sort of workhorse synthesizer. It can do a lot of different styles of sounds, and it's just fast to work with. So that being said, let's very quickly look at the top bar here, and then we'll instantly get into making some sounds. So first off, on the top left we have our Pigments menu, which is very common to Arturia with the way this looks. And we have our main functions here: saving, importing, exporting, resizing the window. The only notable thing right here is the tutorial section, which gives us 2 different tutorials: first look and modulation. If we click on first look, it's going to give us a warning that we're going to overwrite our preset, which is fine. And then you get this pop-up thing, and it will highlight a button, and basically you get to read something, you get to click a button, you get to read something else, you get to click another button, and that's how it's sort of explaining like the main interface, which is not very in-depth, but it might be a good start. And then we have the same one for the modulations and how that works. All right, so to the right of that we have our very advanced browser, where we can choose on different categories, and we can sort by sound designer, all that kind of stuff. And to the right of that we have our quick preset browser, and this is all, if you've ever used an Arturia synth before, this is all the same. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to template, and we're going to choose default, which is going to give us the default patch, which is just going to be a sine wave. And when you play that back with a chord, it sounds like that. Right, so just our sine wave. Now I want to point out one other thing before we get going with the sound itself. At the top right here we can see this light bulb. What this means is that it's going to show different tips based on different controls. Actually, we can see that a little bit better if I choose some sort of preset. Right now, because that light bulb is sort of on, we can see that this thing here is yellow, which means that the sound designer thought this was an interesting sort of thing to tweak, as well as the resonance right here. So basically what this does is it will show different things that are considered to be fun to the sound, which is great for learning. Let's choose another patch like keys. So here we can see the envelope, the mode, and the resonance. And we can also see the range, which was considered to be interesting. So now you can try out this knob in that range. So it gives you a few different things to mess around with. And we can also go into advanced, and then we can edit these ourselves. So that's a little bit, we won't get into that right now. It's just something I wanted to point out. For now, I'm just gonna disable that thing altogether, and I'm gonna go again to my template and then default. Alright, so at the top we can see all our sound sources going from left to right, which is quite common. We can see our wavetable right now, some wavetable effects, and then the routing settings, so whether it's going to filter 1 or filter 2 or both. And we have some wavetable options, and we have a audio modulator here, an audio rate modulator. We'll get into that. And then in the middle here we have our modulation sources, which are LFOs, envelopes, all that stuff. And then at the bottom we actually have those control over those envelopes and LFOs and all that stuff. So let's start by looking at envelope VCA. I was going to say envelope 1, but envelope VCA. This is our master envelope, and it's controlling the output. So let's set the sustain down here to create sort of a plucky sound. which is kind of nice. And then here's one of those unique functions that I mentioned. We can now link the decay with the release, so that if we change the decay, it's also changing the release. If we want to get finer control, we can hold control on our keyboard and it's going to give us smaller increments. So let's create sort of a plucky sound here. And then we can set the decay curve, the attack curve, and of course the attack itself. And we have one button here to switch this into ADR mode, which means it's going to bypass the sustain and it just becomes an attack, decay, release envelope. For now we'll just leave it like this. That's pretty much all you need to know about the envelopes. They're all going to be identical, except that for envelope 2 and 3 we can choose a different gate source, which is the source that will restart your envelope. So that's fine. Then let's go to the LFO panel and let's actually do our first assignment, because that envelope was already assigned. So to assign something, what we can do is we can hover over any control, like for example this fine control, and we get to see that plus thingy there, and we can click that, and then this changes in the middle and it's going to show us the modulation amount. So let's for example give some amount for LFO1, which is now, as you can see, controlling the fine tuning. We can set the rate to Hertz, and we can set that to about maybe 4 Hertz. And now we get our sort of vibrato kind of sound. So if I click on that again, I can increase that amount. And now I can let this fade in over time so that the LFO gradually starts to increase the modulation amount. I can switch this from unipolar to bipolar, which means a positive and negative modulation or only positive modulation. Again, I can choose a re-trigger source. In this case, actually, I want this to run in free mode. So I'm going to choose free running so that this LFO is not restarting for every node. Then we have the symmetry, which is sometimes called the duty cycle or the pulse width, if we're talking about pulse waves. And we can actually change the waveform itself. In that case, the symmetry will make more sense. Alright, so let's double click to reset that. So now we have a little bit of a vibrato, and I'm going to go to my envelopes and I'm going to increase the sustain a little bit there. So we get a nice and ambient sound. Then let's go to the functions. This one I found a little bit confusingly named because it's basically just an MSEG, a multi-segment envelope generator, to throw in a fancy term. But functions to me sounds like it's going to be some math function. It's not like that. It's just an envelope. It can loop. It can be in one-shot mode, which means that it's going to be exactly like an envelope. And we have 3 different ones here. So let's choose function 1. Let's create a new point just by clicking. If we hold control, we can snap these to the grid lines in the background. So I'm just going to create some sort of a sequence here. And then I'm gonna set that to 1. No, actually, yeah. So if I set this to 1, and if I play this, you can see that it triggers once and then it stops. If I set this to loop, it's gonna repeat. And if I set it to run, it's always gonna be running, even if my sound is not playing. So this one we're gonna set to the wavetable position, and let's choose another method. So before, what we did is we hovered over the control that we wanted, and then we clicked the plus sign, and then here we can choose the function 2 amount. That's one way. Another way is to click on function 2 right here, and then you can see that it's giving us a completely different view. And now we can just drag here to change the modulation depth. And then we can also select a sidechain modulator, which is not the same as a kick to bass sidechain. It's basically a modulator that modulates the modulation amount. And a simple example of that would be velocity, which is often scaling the amount of the envelope controlling the amplitude. So then we have 1 destination and 2 sort of sources for that. We'll get into that some other day. So for now, with this function 1, we're controlling the position of the wavetable. So let's actually get into those wavetables. So we've covered most of the modulation. Let's take a look at this panel right here. So first at the top it says morph, which means that what we can see here, those different waves that we have, a sine, a triangle, a saw and a square, we can morph between those smoothly, which is what we hear right now. Or we can switch that off and then it's gonna go from one to the other instantly. So it becomes more clicky. For now, I'm just gonna bypass this real quick so that we're not hearing that. So that is wave morphing. And then here at the top we can set where we want to send that. At the bottom here though, this is the interesting part. We have 4 different wave modifiers. I'm reluctant to call them wave effects because they actually modify the wave shape. So the first one is frequency modulation, or in other words FM, and we can choose between linear and exponential there. Exponential would be more natural, linear often more usable. And then we have phase mod, which is basically the same as FM. It's a different implementation, has a slightly different sound. We have phase distortion, which maps the phase to a target wave, or rather it maps the amplitude of a target wave to the phase. And phase is just the wave offset. It's where the wave will start. This is all. It gets very technical, but the main thing to get used to is the sound. So just experiment with these and you'll get an idea of what you can do with that. And folding, more commonly called wave shaping, maps the wave to another wave as well, which we can choose right here. The cool thing here though is that all of these are linked with this modulation oscillator, which is an oscillator that we use to control modulation signals, or to send modulation signals. And to give you an example of that, you might be thinking, well, isn't that the same as an LFO? And it sort of is. It's just running way faster. So let's try to set LFO2 to, for example, the wavetable position. So we're going to choose LFO2 and we're going to set that to the position, and then we can hear that modulating. And for now I'll just go to my envelopes and I'll give it a little bit more of a sustain, a little bit less of a decay. So right now we can actually hear this modulation and we can see it as well. It's sort of this cycling motion. However, if I set the speed of this LFO faster, like above 20 Hertz, it becomes so fast that we don't hear the individual cycles anymore. It starts to become one tone. This is what audio rate modulators do. This is what FM synthesis does and what this modulator attempts to do. So it's basically a super fast LFO. So for now, let's actually remove that one from the wavetable position. So that is what this thing is doing, and here we set the depth of that modulation. So for example, let's I know I've been talking a lot. Let's set this to frequency modulate, and then we'll give it some amount. And now we can change the pitch of this modulator. And we can set that to relative or absolute, which means relative means it's going to listen to the inputted MIDI notes. Absolute is just fixed pitch and Hertz is fixed frequency. And we can also send this wave to the output so that we can hear it, which is more clear if I choose something like a saw. So let's use a couple of these. And maybe let's use LFO2 to control some of the modulation depths. Alright, so while we're in this area, let's also talk about the Unison real quick. So Unison, here we can set the number of voices, which basically means that it's going to play back the signal again. So if you play one note, in this case it's going to play that sound 3 times, and then we can create a difference between those voices using the detuning and the stereo. With voices, you can quite literally think about a choir where you have multiple singers that sing the same melody or the same sort of sound, but they all have a slightly different timbre, and because of that we get this rich sound. So that's what we do with Unison. And then we have a classic mode or normal mode and a chord mode, which is quite different. Here it's going to sing at different pitches, or it's going to pitch the different voices to like thirds and fifths. Which in our case doesn't make sense because we already have chords. So I'm going to switch back to classic, detune this a little bit stereo, get a little bit of a richer sound. Alright, so that's nice. That's for the main wavetable overview here. A few other things to note: we can set this to 2D or 3D. Just fancy visuals, and then here we can actually choose different waves, and we can import different waves as well, using just any audio file on our system. So we could actually go with a few different ones, see what they sound like. So right now, because of the distortion, they're not making a very big difference. We can set this down a little bit to hear that a little bit better. I like this. It has sort of a pad sound to it. I'm going to add some of the distortions back again. So now let's take a look at the actual filter. So right now this sound is sending to filter 1, which we find right here. We have multiple filters and filter types as well. Like these are modeled filters, and Arturia is famous for their filters. These are really great sounding filters. For now, let's just use a low pass. Let's go with function 2. We can select that here as well and set that to the cutoff. To create sort of a plucky sound. I'll set this to an envelope mode so that it's only gonna trigger once. And then we can change the routing here. So right now the filter routing is A to B, which means filter 1 to filter 2. We can set this in a parallel mode where the signal is flowing through both filters at the same time. I'm going to set this to the first type, and then I can also switch the order, so I can change filter 2 to the different slot, which only makes sense if we're using different filters, because then it will actually change the sound. We can choose a different filter here. Like a SEM filter, which is one of those modeled filters, or we can choose a matrix filter, which I happen to like. So we have all these different types here to choose from. So that's getting a pretty interesting sound. Now let's switch over to the effects right here. So this is a quite heavily featured complete panel for all our effects, and what you'll see is that we have 3 main categories. We have bus A, bus B, and we have a send bus, which is kind of different from what we're used to probably. On bus A, if I select that, I can see 3 effects here that belong to that bus. If I click bus B, I can see 3 different effects that belong to that, and then we have the send bus, which right now has a reverb. So this to me was a little bit confusing because it looks like this reverb here in the middle belongs to this bus B, but these are all actually separate panels. So let's set the dry wet on this delay. And then let's go back. I want to create a little bit more of a sharp sound, so I might go back to my basic waveforms rather than the formants. And I might also want to change my filter routing a little bit to be a little bit brighter. And then let's set function 3 to control the wavetable position. I'm getting a little bit more advanced here, but that's just because I want to showcase more of the controls to you guys. So we'll set this to loop. And we'll slow down the rates to be 1 bar. Alright, so now let's go back to our effects. So let's choose bus B, for example, and see what we have. So we have filters, equalizers, compressors, bit crushers, a lot of distortion types, a chorus, a flanger, phaser, stereo panning, and the delay and reverb, which we've used before. These are all like pretty high quality effects. I really like messing around with them. And some of them have some nice like special features as well, like this ping pong delay as a built-in sort of bandpass filter, and a stereo spread, which is kind of nice, which offsets the left from the right. I'm gonna let you do most of the exploring for that. What I just want to point out here, because I think it might be the most confusing part, is this panel on the right. So what we see here is both the volume for our bus A and our bus B, and you can think of these really as DAW buses. So right now on bus B we have a delay. Let's also load a overdrive there, distortion. I can now listen to just bus B, which is interesting. We don't hear any sound there, and the reason we don't hear any sound is because of our routing. So here at the top you can see that bus A is going into bus B, so if the volume of A is down, we're not going to hear anything in B as well. If I set this to be a parallel routing, now we should be able to hear this. And then we also have inverted routing right here, which means that B is going to send to A, which again we will not hear anything because the volume of A is down. So this might not seem like a big deal, but it can actually create quite different sounds, because right now bus B has this distortion, and the distortion is then going to bus A. So because we use an inverted routing, B goes to A. We can see that in the bottom left as well of the synthesizer. So that means that first the sound is getting distorted, and then the distortion is being sort of smoothed out by the reverb if we use some dry wet, which will sound quite different than the other way around. It sounds a lot smoother like that. And then finally we have our effect bus, which is a send and return effect bus, which means that we can send the signal to that and then basically return it right before the output, which can be very useful for modulation, for example. So let's say that our return bus, which is the signal from the bus, is always up, but the send bus is down. What we can do is we can create like a very big sort of reverb sound here, and then let's actually switch off the reverb in other places so the sound is fairly dry except for the delays. We'll give some different delay times here. So right now we get a dry sound. What we could do is we could set up an envelope to control the send level, such as envelope 3. So now if we go to that envelope, we give it a little bit of a slow attack, it will send the signal very shortly to that bus, and then we get to hear that reverb. And I can make that a little bit more clear to hear if we also use some distortions. And we can use a delay on that as well. And now let's make this into a plucky sound. So let's go with a slightly faster envelope. Let's see, this one is pretty fast. Let's create a faster sort of plug here for the function. So that is most of the Wavetable functions. Let's now look into the actual analog engine. So what we haven't done yet is switched on engine 2. All of the things we did, we have a completely new engine here. And we can enable that, and here we can choose between that Wavetable and between that analog. So let's switch off engine 1. So we're just listening to engine 2. And for now, I'll also switch off the level modulation. So if we go to effects, we could see that that was being modulated by envelope 3. Let's switch that off for now. So we get a dry sound. And then let's go back to the synth page. So here we have 3 different oscillators within one panel, and some of the functions have changed. Like on the left here, for example, we now have a drift parameter, and we don't have unison anymore. And with drift we can offset the oscillators to make them sound more analog. And we have some very basic wave shapes here, triangles, squares, saws. We have a width control, which only works for the square wave and for the triangle wave. And this looks a little bit basic, but the cool thing here is that you can use oscillator 3 to really modulate any of the other waves. So again, we can use that trick of the modulation oscillator here quite effectively. And you can see how that changes the waveform of oscillator 1 and oscillator 2. And for now, let's just switch off the filter so we can listen to the dry sound. So here, even though it's completely different, we do get some very cool like new sounds, because we can now use some fancy other more analog options, like the modulation source, but also oscillator syncing, which is gonna sync the phase of one oscillator to the phase of another. So let's come up with a sound here that is sort of a counterpart to the other sound that we made there. So let's create a fast, plucky kind of sound, and we're going to use envelope 2. And the reason I'm using envelope 2 is because I can see quite quickly that it's not being assigned yet. So I'm going to click on that, and then I'm going to map that to our volume control here, and I'm going to give that a very short decay. And I'm going to set that to the volume of oscillator 2 as well. So now we get a very short sound there, and I'll make it that very high as well. Okay, I don't want to do that. So now we can actually see that we have multiple different sources here in the panel. So I'm going to click out of this and just set my coarse tuning to maybe 24 even. And you can hear that without the drift it sounds a lot more stable, less analog. We can add some noise to this as well. And we would want to give that the same envelope too. So let's set that to our, choose envelope 2, set that to the volume. Alright, so now let's combine this with our first sound again. And again, let's set envelope 3 to control the send level like we did before. So that's most of the interface. What I haven't shown you yet is the macros, because they're pretty straightforward. You can just assign them to whatever you want. You can find them right here. So you could assign a macro to your reverb dry wet, or your delay dry wet, and you can choose maybe more overdrive, and then you have one macro to sort of change all of those settings. So you can call this one effects. So that's macros. And then also what I haven't talked about is these more advanced modulators, like Turing, which is sort of a random, controlled randomness. We have a sample and hold, a binary, which is really math operations. And then we have these comb, which you might think of comb filter, but it actually stands for combinate, where we can choose different sources and combine them together. Did I say combinate? I meant combine. Oh, it's actually called combinate. That's odd. But we can choose two sources, like envelope 3 and this Turing, and then we can say how we want to combine those and then send that to some parameter. That is one thing we'll need to check out in a different video. And then very quickly here, I want to show you the sequencer, which right now, because we're playing chords, let's use the arpeggiator. And this looks very similar to, for example, the FM8 sequencer. We have different lanes here that can do different things, like the gate length, sliding. Let's listen to this quickly. So it's pretty straightforward sequencer. The main notable thing about this, I found the polyrhythm. If we switch that on, I thought this was pretty cool. What you can do is you can resize these lanes to individual sort of sizes. So what I could do, for example, was I could make my velocity a lane of thirds. So this is going to repeat every third step. And that this might not be the perfect sound to show that, but it's going to create sort of these overlapping rhythms, where some things are going to repeat every 3 notes and others every 16 or 8 notes. So that gives you a polyrhythmic like structure, which can be very interesting and can create nice sort of rhythms. So that is a quite lengthy overview of Pigments and what it can do. There are some cool functions that I haven't talked about yet, but I'm sure we'll get into those later. For now, I hope this gives an idea of what this synth can do, and I hope that you have fun while messing around with it. I really had fun playing with this one, and I think that's what the rest of my day will be looking like as well. All right, thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys in another video.